If someone had told me 10 years ago, when I was a gangly teenager hiding in my room, that the silent, hulking police officer in my dad's kitchen would one day become the axis my entire world tilted on, I would have laughed. Or, more likely, just shrunk further into my oversized hoodie, incapable of a response. Life, it turns out, has a strange and often terrifying sense of humor. His name was Marcus Evans, and for the longest time, he was nothing more than a presence. A block of granite in a police uniform that materialized in our house every third Thursday for poker night. My life was a collection of carefully curated routines. Wake up, coffee, sketchpad, books, silence. My room was my kingdom, a fortress built of paper and charcoal dust. The rest of the house was just territory to be navigated with minimal contact. I was an observer, a chronicler of things I never participated in. And I observed Marcus. I couldn't not. He was a stark contrast to my dad and his other friends who were all laughter and backslapping and noise. Marcus was quiet. He didn't fill space with pointless chatter. He occupied it with a kind of gravitational pull. He'd sit at the kitchen table, his broad back to the hallway, where I sometimes lurked, a bottle of beer untouched in his hand for the first hour. He listened more than he spoke, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, missing nothing. He was, to my anxious artistic mind, a fascinating contradiction. The crisp, authoritative lines of his uniform against the weary set of his shoulders. The sheer size of him, the solid muscle that seemed to strain the fabric of his shirt, versus the gentle way he'd handle the poker chips, stacking them with a meticulous precision that felt almost delicate. He was a man built for force, who seemed to crave stillness. My attraction to him was a secret I kept buried so deep, it felt like a part of my anatomy. A vital organ I couldn't risk exposing. It was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of my quiet life. It was dangerous. He was my dad's friend. He was a cop. He was a man who moved through the world with a confidence I could only dream of. A world that had no space for someone like me. So I watched from a distance, from the safety of doorways and shadows, and I drew him. Hundreds of times. The sharp angle of his jaw, the way a single lock of dark hair fell across his forehead, the tension in his hands. He was a ghost on my pages, a person I knew intimately but had never truly met. The distance between us was more than just the length of the hallway. It was a chasm. On the rare occasions our paths crossed, his gaze would slide over me with a polite, vacant nod. I was just Jim's kid. A piece of the background scenery. That acknowledgement, so brief and impersonal, felt like a physical blow every single time. It cemented my invisibility. It reinforced the wall I had built around myself. Brick by painful brick. He was the world outside, and I was the boy behind the glass. And that was how it was meant to be. Then came the Tuesday that shattered everything. The phone call was a frantic, crackling thing from my aunt, halfway across the country. My grandmother had fallen. It was bad. My dad, his face pale and strained, threw clothes into a bag with the harried movements of a man suddenly untethered from his own life. "I have to go, Leo. I don't know for how long." I just nodded, my own world shrinking to the frantic beat of my heart. Him, leaving. The house, empty. Just me. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. As he was about to leave, his phone rang again. His side of the conversation was clipped, full of concern. "Is he okay?" "Jesus, no, of course not. Tell him. Tell him to come here. We've got the space. Just for a few days until he's back on his feet. It's the least I can do." My blood ran cold. I knew who he was talking about before he even said the name. Marcus was injured, Dad said, hanging up the phone, his attention already elsewhere. Some scuffle on a domestic call. Cracked a couple of ribs, sprained his wrist bad. Can't manage the stairs in his apartment. He's going to stay in the guest room for a bit. The guest room. The room directly across the hall from mine. And just like that, the hurricane made landfall. The carefully constructed piece of my solitude was about to be invaded by the one person on earth who made my foundations tremble. The routines were broken. The silence was about to be filled with his breathing, his presence, his pain. The world outside the glass wasn't just pressing in. It was about to come right through the door and sleep across the hall. There was nowhere left for me to hide. He arrived an hour after my dad left for the airport. Another officer dropped him off, helping him up the front steps. Marcus moved stiffly, his face a mask of controlled pain. His left arm was in a tight black sling, and every breath seemed to be a calculated effort. He wasn't wearing his uniform, just a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, and the absence of the crisp blue fabric made him seem both larger and more vulnerable. The fortress had been breached. The first 24 hours were an exercise in excruciating awareness. I was a ghost in my own home, tiptoeing down the hall, holding my breath every time I passed his closed door. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the low groan of the floorboards as he shifted his weight, the soft click of his door, the muffled sound of the television from his room. His presence was a physical weight in the air. I left a tray of food outside his door for dinner, knocked softly, and then fled back to my room like a startled animal, my heart hammering against my ribs. A full minute later, I heard the door creak open, the tray being lifted, the door clicking shut. It was the most profound interaction we'd ever had. The next morning, I found the tray back outside his door, the plate empty, the glass drained. It felt like a message from another world. I had to go in. I had to ask if he needed anything. It was the decent thing to do. It was also the most terrifying thing I could imagine. I knocked, my knuckles barely grazing the wood. "Yeah?" His voice was rough, thick with sleep. My own voice caught in my throat. "It's, Leo. Do you need anything? Coffee?" A long pause. I was about to turn and run when the lock clicked. The door opened a few inches. He was standing there, shirtless, the sling stark against his skin. A wide swath of white bandages was wrapped tightly around his torso. My eyes snagged on the dark, angry-looking bruises peeking out from under the edges, a violent bloom of purple and blue against his pale skin. I could see the rigid control in his posture, the effort it took just to stand there. "Coffee would be good," he said, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. Black. As I stood in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee to brew, my hands shook. I had seen more of him in those 10 seconds than I had in 10 years of watching him from afar. The granite statue had cracks. The impenetrable fortress had been breached from the inside. I saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his mouth, the faint tremor in his good hand as he braced it against the doorframe. He wasn't a symbol anymore. He was just a man, in pain, in my house. I brought the mug to his room, my heart a frantic trapped bird in my chest. This time, he opened the door fully. The room was dim, the curtains drawn. He had managed to pull on a pair of sweatpants. He took the mug from me, and for a fraction of a second, his fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing. It was everything. A jolt of pure electricity shot up my arm, a searing heat that left my skin tingling. My breath hitched. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. My eyes flew to his, wide with panic. For the first time, he was looking directly at me. Really looking. And his expression wasn't vacant or dismissive. It was watchful, aware. He saw my reaction. He must have felt it too. The air between us grew thick, charged with a sudden, terrifying voltage. I mumbled something about breakfast and fled, the ghost of his touch scorching my skin. My carefully ordered world was tilting, spinning faster and faster. The distance was collapsing. Later that day, the dynamic shifted in a way I never could have predicted. I was in the kitchen, trying to lose myself in the methodical chopping of vegetables for a soup, when he appeared in the doorway. He looked pale, and there was a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead. I, he started, and the hesitation in his voice was so foreign it stopped me mid-chop. I need some help. Marcus Evans did not ask for help. He was the one who helped others, who exuded competence and control. Seeing him there, humbled by his own body, was like watching a mountain crumble. The dressing, he said, gesturing vaguely toward his ribs with it, his good hand. The doctor said, I need to change it. I can't reach. My stomach filled with a swarm of anxious bees. Me? He was asking me? I was the one who could barely make eye contact, the one who dissolved into a puddle of nerves in his presence, and he wanted me to touch him. Intentionally. Okay, I heard myself say, my voice sounding thin and distant. He led me to the guest bathroom. The first aid kit my dad kept under the sink was open on the counter, a sterile field of gauze, tape, and antiseptic wipes. The air was close, thick with the medicinal smell. He turned his back to me and with a pained grunt, peeled off his t-shirt. My breath caught. The drawings, the furtive glances, they were nothing compared to this. His back was a landscape of taut muscle, defined and powerful even in his injured state, and across it, the stark reality of his job. A few faded silvery scars I'd never seen before. One, a thin white line near his shoulder blade. Another, a puckered mark lower down. These were the stories his body told, stories I had never been close enough to read. The tape is on the edge there, he said, his voice low and tight. He was bracing himself against the counter, his knuckles white. My fingers trembled as I found the edge of the medical tape and began to peel it back. His skin was warm beneath my hands. The heat seemed to seep into my palms, traveling up my arms, settling deep in my chest. I worked slowly, carefully, my entire universe narrowing to this single, terrifying, intimate task. Unwrapping the bandage felt like unwrapping a secret. With each layer of gauze I removed, more of the bruising was revealed. It was a brutal, ugly tapestry, a testament to the violence he faced as a matter of course. I cleaned the wound as the instructions said, my touch as gentle as I could manage. He flinched once, a sharp intake of breath, but said nothing. The silence in the small room was deafening, broken only by the crinkle of the wrapper for the new bandage and the sound of our breathing. I was so close I could smell the faint scent of soap on his skin, feel the heat radiating from his body. I was touching him, tending to him. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. I, the watcher, the ghost, was now the caregiver. He, the strong, silent authority figure, was vulnerable, dependent on my unsteady hands. In that small, sterile bathroom, we were just two people, stripped of our usual roles. And I realized with a sudden heart-stopping clarity that I wasn't just attracted to the idea of him anymore. I was terrified for the man himself, for the body that carried these wounds. When I finished, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely smooth down the last piece of tape. Thanks, he murmured, his voice rough. He didn't turn around immediately. He just stood there, leaning on the counter, his head bowed. The moment stretched, thin and fragile. It's okay, I whispered, and backed out of the bathroom, needing air, needing distance. But there was no distance left to be had. A line had been crossed. I had touched his wounds, and in doing so, I had exposed my own. The days that followed fell into a new, strange rhythm. The initial terror began to subside, replaced by a tense but manageable domesticity. I would make our meals, and he would emerge from his room to eat with me at the kitchen table. The first few times, the silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket smothering the space between us. I'd focus on my plate, my ears burning, hyper-aware of his every movement, the scrape of his fork, the sound of him swallowing. But slowly, tentatively, we began to talk. It started small. "This is good," he said one evening, gesturing to the pasta I'd made. "Thanks. It's just a recipe my mom used to make." A flicker of something in his eyes. "Your dad mentioned she was a great cook." It was the first time he'd ever mentioned my mother, who had passed away years ago. It was a simple statement, but it felt like an offering, a small bridge built across the chasm of our silence. We talked about her for a few minutes, and I found myself speaking without the usual stutter of anxiety. I was telling him things, sharing a part of myself. He just listened, his gaze steady, attentive. He was a good listener. It was, I realized, his superpower. He made you feel heard. I started noticing more things. The way he'd meticulously organize the mail on the counter with his good hand, a quiet attempt to impose order on his forced helplessness. The way his eyes would sometimes drift to the window, a look of profound longing on his face, a man desperate to be back in the world. I saw the frustration warring with the patience. One afternoon, I was sketching in the living room, a habit so ingrained I did it without thinking. He came out of his room and stopped, watching me. I froze, my hand hovering over the page, my immediate instinct to hide my work, to hide myself. "Don't stop," he said, his voice quiet. He moved to the armchair across from me, lowering himself into it with a soft grunt. "What are you drawing?" My heart hammered. My sketchbooks were my private diaries, filled with my secret observations of the world, filled with him. My current page was thankfully just a study of the light hitting a bowl of fruit on the table. "Just stuff," I mumbled, my face hot. "Can I see?" The request was so direct, so simple, and it sent me into a full-blown panic. I couldn't refuse, not after he'd let me see him so vulnerable. I hesitantly flipped the book closed and passed it to him. He took it with his good hand, his touch careful, reverent. He opened it to the first page and went silent. He turned the pages slowly, one by one. My entire life felt like it was being laid bare for his inspection. There were landscapes, still lifes, studies of hands, architectural details, and then there were the portraits. Not explicitly of him, but his influence was everywhere. A drawing of a man's jaw, sharp and defined. A study of hands resting on a table, strong and calloused. A figure seen from behind, broad-shouldered and still. I held my breath, waiting for the judgment, the polite dismissal, the awkward closing of the book. He didn't say a word. He just kept looking, his expression unreadable. My stomach twisted itself into a tight, painful knot. He was seeing me, not the quiet, awkward kid in the hallway. The person underneath. He was seeing the way I saw the world, the way I saw him. He finally reached the last page and closed the book gently. He looked up and his eyes met mine. That stormy gray gaze was no longer distant. It was intense, searching. "You have a gift, Leo," he said, his voice low and serious. "You see things the way they really are." And in that moment, something inside me, a tightly locked door I had been hiding behind for years, began to creak open. He didn't just see the drawings. He saw the person holding the pencil. He saw me, and he wasn't turning away. The storm arrived on the fifth night. It rolled in from the west, a bruised and angry-looking sky that swallowed the afternoon sun whole. The wind began to howl, rattling the windows in their frames, a lonely, mournful sound. The first crack of thunder was a violent percussion that shook the entire house. And then, the lights flickered once, twice, and died. We were plunged into a sudden, profound darkness. The only light was the intermittent, ghostly flash of lightning that illuminated the room in stark, momentary tableaus. The familiar shapes of the living room became strange and menacing. "Power's out," Marcus stated, his voice calm and steady in the blackness, a reassuring anchor. "I'll get candles," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I fumbled my way to the kitchen, my hands skimming along the walls. I found the emergency candles and a lighter in the junk drawer, my fingers clumsy in the dark. When I returned to the living room, Marcus had not moved from his chair. I lit a few candles, placing them on the coffee table. The small, flickering flames pushed back the oppressive darkness, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The room felt smaller now, more intimate. The outside world had vanished, replaced by the roar of the wind and the percussive drumming of rain against the roof. It was just the two of us, trapped in a small bubble of golden light. The usual buffers, the television, the daylight, the separate rooms were gone. There was nothing left but the space between us. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames. The storm was a wild thing outside, but in here a strange peace had settled. "Does it hurt?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I nodded toward his ribs. He shifted slightly, a soft wince crossing his features in the candlelight. "Yeah, a bit. The damp weather makes it worse." He looked down at his hands. "The worst part is the helplessness, not being able to just do things." "You're not helpless," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my own voice. "You're healing." He looked up at me, a small sad smile touching his lips. "There's a difference." He paused, his gaze drifting into the fire. "This job, it takes things from you. You build up walls, you have to. You see the worst of people, day in, day out. After a while, you forget how to let anyone in. The walls get so high, you can't even see over them yourself." He was talking about more than the job. I knew it. He was giving me a piece of himself, a shard of the man behind the badge, and the silence. He was telling me why he was the way he was. "The silence in this house," he continued, his voice softer now, almost a confession. "When your dad's here, it's always full of noise. But with you, it's a different kind of quiet. It's not empty." My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. He was closing the distance, sentence by sentence. He was walking across that bridge he'd started building. "I need to check on something," I said, standing up abruptly. It was a lie. I just needed to move, to escape the intensity of his gaze, the raw honesty in his voice. I fled to my room, my sanctuary, but it offered no comfort. His words followed me, echoing in the enclosed space. I stood by my window, watching the rain lash against the glass. I was a coward. He was opening up, showing me his wounds, the ones on the inside, and I had run away. I had spent years dreaming of a moment of connection, and now that it was here, I was terrified of it. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, vibrated through the floor. I thought of him, alone in the living room, in pain, sitting in the dark. I had to go back. I couldn't leave him there. But he wasn't in the living room. The candles flickered in an empty armchair. A knot of panic tightened in my stomach. I moved down the hall, my bare feet silent on the floorboards. The door to his room was slightly ajar, a sliver of candlelight visible from within. I pushed it open gently. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his good hand, His shoulders slumped. He hadn't heard me enter. He looked utterly defeated. The granite had finally crumbled. I took a hesitant step into the room. The floorboard creaked. He looked up, startled. His eyes were shadowed in the flickering light, but I could see the pain in them, and it wasn't just physical. The room was thick with his loneliness. This was it. The moment where everything could change, or everything could shatter. He looked at me, standing there in his doorway, and his expression softened. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease just a little. And then he said the words that recalibrated my entire existence. "I was hoping you'd come in." His voice was quiet, a raw, vulnerable thing. It wasn't a command or a request. It was a confession. A confession that he didn't want to be alone, that he wanted me there. I walked toward him, my legs feeling unsteady, as if the floor was tilting beneath me. I stopped just before him, close enough to feel the warmth from his body, close enough to see the storm in his eyes, mirroring the one outside. All my fear, all my anxiety, it all just dissolved. It was replaced by a singular, overwhelming need to close this final, infinitesimal distance between us. He didn't move. He just watched me, his breath catching. He was giving me the choice. He was letting me be the brave one. So I was. I knelt down in front of him, so our eyes were level. I reached out, my hand trembling, and gently touched his cheek. His skin was rough with stubble, warm. He closed his eyes at my touch, leaning into my hand with a soft, shuddering sigh. It was a surrender, a release. And then I leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of passion or frantic desire. It was slow, hesitant. It was a question. It was years of unspoken longing, of secret sketches and furtive glances, finally given a voice. His lips were soft, uncertain at first, and then they answered me. His good hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer. It was a kiss of profound, aching tenderness. It was recognition. It was the feeling of coming home to a place I'd never been before. In the heart of the storm, in the flickering candlelight, the world fell away, and there was only this. Only us. I woke to the relentless gray light of morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and unnervingly bright. For a moment, a blissful, hazy moment, I forgot. I stretched, a deep sense of peace settling in my bones. And then it all came rushing back. The blackout, the confession, the kiss. I turned my head. The other side of the bed was empty. The sheets were cold. A leaden weight dropped into my stomach. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up my throat. I sat up, my heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. The door to the guest room was closed. The house was silent. But it wasn't the peaceful silence of yesterday. It was a dead, empty silence. An absence. I scrambled out of bed, pulling on a pair of jeans, my hands shaking. I had to see him. I had to know. Had I dreamed it? Had the storm and the candlelight and the vulnerability created a fantasy that had never really happened? I crept into the hallway. His door was shut tight. I listened, pressing my ear against the cool wood, but heard nothing. No breathing, no movement, just the accusing tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. I went downstairs. The kitchen was clean, sterile. The coffee pot was cold. The candles from last night were gone, the living room restored to its normal, impassive state. It was as if the storm had never happened, as if he had never looked at me that way. My mind began to spiral, a vortex of self-recrimination and doubt. It was a mistake, a huge, catastrophic mistake. He was in pain, on medication maybe. He was lonely. I had taken advantage of his vulnerability. He regretted it. Of course he regretted it. How could he not? A man like him, with someone like me. It was absurd. I was a fool. I was standing in the middle of the kitchen, drowning in my own anxiety, when I heard a car door slam outside. I rushed to the window, my heart seizing. A familiar black sedan was parked at the curb. Another officer, one of my dad's poker buddies, was walking up the path. And then Marcus's door opened upstairs. I heard his footsteps, slow and heavy, coming down the stairs. I ducked back from the window, my back pressed against the wall, my breath held tight in my chest. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed. Jeans, a fresh t-shirt, his boots on. His sling was perfectly adjusted. The mask was back in place. The granite statue was reassembled. He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the refrigerator, the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but my face. "Morning," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any of the warmth from the night before. It was the voice he used for strangers, for polite, meaningless interactions. "Hi," I choked out. My own voice sounded alien. The doorbell rang, a shrill, jarring sound that made me jump. "That'll be Mike," he said, moving toward the front door. "He's going to put me up for a few days. Easier that way. Easier that way." The words were a slap in the face. Easier than being here. Easier than facing me. Easier than dealing with the mistake he'd made in the dark. He opened the door. I could hear their muffled voices, a man's easy camaraderie that I would never be a part of. He came back into the hall to grab the small duffel bag he'd brought. He walked right past me, still refusing to meet my eyes. At the door, he finally paused. He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his profile. "Thanks for the help, Leo." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, a sound of absolute finality. I watched through the window as he got into the car, his movements stiff. He never once looked back at the house. The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. The silence that descended was heavier than any I had ever known. It was a crushing, suffocating weight. My solitude, once a comfort, was now a punishment. The house was a museum of moments that might have been fictions. Every room held his ghost. The armchair in the living room, the spot at the kitchen table, the bathroom counter he'd leaned on, and the bed, my bed, that still held the faint, fading scent of his skin. I spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended animation. I didn't draw. I didn't read. I barely ate. I just drifted from room to room, replaying every second of that night, dissecting every word, every touch, searching for the clue I had missed. The self-loathing was a bitter taste in my mouth. I had ruined it. Kay had misread everything and pushed him away, confirming his every assumption about me being just a weird, quiet kid. The chasm between us was back, wider and deeper than ever before. It was now filled with the wreckage of what I'd done. The silence from his end was absolute. No text, no call, nothing. It was a confirmation. It was over, before it had ever begun. The hope that had flickered to life in the dark had been extinguished by the harsh light of day, leaving behind nothing but the cold, bitter smoke. On the 4th day, I surrendered. I accepted it. It was a fluke, a moment of shared loneliness brought on by a storm. I needed to forget it, to put the walls back up, higher and stronger this time. I was in my room, gathering the sketches of him, the evidence of my foolish obsession, planning to burn them, to erase him when the doorbell rang. My first thought was that my dad was home early. I went downstairs, my heart leaden, preparing my face to look normal, to pretend nothing had happened. I opened the door. and my world stopped turning. It was Marcus. He was standing on the porch, not in uniform, just wearing jeans and a dark Henley shirt. His arm was still in the sling. He looked tired. He looked nervous. The impenetrable confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, uncertain vulnerability that mirrored my own. He wasn't looking over my shoulder or at the floor. He was looking directly at me, his stormy eyes holding mine, and in them I saw a maelstrom of regret and fear. We stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between us, thick with everything left unsaid. My hand was white-knuckled on the doorknob. My mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by shock. He was the one who broke the silence. Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I just nodded, stepping back to let him pass. He moved into the entryway, and the familiar scent of him, soap and something uniquely his, filled the space. He didn't move further into the house. He just stood there, a few feet from me, looking as lost as I felt. "I'm an idiot," he said finally, the words blunt and rough. "And I'm sorry." "For what?" The question was out before I could stop it. I needed to hear it. I needed to know which part he was sorry for. The kiss or the leaving? He scrubbed his good hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. "For leaving like that. For not calling. For running." He finally met my eyes again, and the honesty there was staggering. "I panicked, Leo. That's all it was. I panicked." I just stared at him, my throat too tight to speak. "I haven't felt anything like," he gestured vaguely between us, "like that in a very long time. Maybe ever. It's not territory I know how to navigate." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I deal with bad guys and paperwork. That's what I know. This feeling things, I'm not good at it." "So you ran," I whispered. It wasn't an accusation. It was a clarification. "Yeah," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I ran. I got back to the world of sirens and noise and things I understood, and I told myself it was a mistake, that I'd imagined it, that it was just the storm. I tried to put the walls back up." He looked up at me, his expression desperate. "But they wouldn't stay up. All I could think about was the quiet, about you, about how I felt when you looked at me." He took a hesitant step closer. The air crackled. "The last few days have been hell," he confessed, his voice raw. "Being away from here, away from you. The silence I went back to wasn't peaceful. It was just empty. I think I'm done with being good at being alone." All the air left my lungs in a rush. The fear and doubt that had been my constant companions for days began to recede, washed away by the tide of his confession. He had felt it too. He had been just as scared as I was. "I thought you regretted it," I said, the words thick with the phantom pain of the last few days. "I thought I'd made a mistake." "No," he said, his voice firm, resolute. He closed the remaining distance between us, his presence filling my entire world. "The only mistake was me walking out that door." He reached out, not with his injured arm, but with his good hand. He didn't touch my face or my shoulder. He took my hand. His fingers wrapped around mine, his grip firm, warm, and grounding. It wasn't a gesture of passion. It was a gesture of intent, an anchor, a promise. Right there, in the full daylight of the entryway, he held my hand. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running anymore. "I'm not good at this," he repeated, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "I'll probably screw it up, but I'd like to try, if you'll let me." A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down my cheek. I hadn't even realized I was crying. I squeezed his hand, my answer to his unspoken question. "Okay," I whispered, Okay. A slow smile spread across his face. A real smile. One that reached his eyes and transformed his entire expression. It was like watching the sun break through the storm clouds. And in that moment, I knew the recoil was over. The push and pull had finally settled into a place of quiet, terrifying, beautiful stillness. He was here. He had come back. That day marked the beginning of our new reality. A life built not in the shadows or the flickering candlelight of a storm, but in the steady, quiet light of day. It was awkward at first. We were two people from different worlds, trying to learn a language that neither of us was fluent in. But we were patient. He stayed. My dad called. His trip extended. And when I told him Marcus was back, that he was helping me out around the house, there was a pause. But my dad trusted Marcus implicitly, and he just said, "Good. Glad he's there to look out for you." The irony was a sweet, secret thing. Our days fell into a new kind of domesticity, one that was both mundane and miraculous. We started with coffee. Every morning, I'd wake up to the smell of it brewing. I'd come downstairs to find him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, a mug waiting for me. We'd sit at the table, not in the tense silence of before, but in a comfortable quiet. The only sounds the clink of ceramic and the soft light of morning pouring through the window. It was simple. It was everything. He'd watch me draw, not with the unreadable intensity of before, but with a soft curiosity. He'd ask me questions about my work, about the way I saw things, and I'd ask him about his day, the parts he could tell me, and I'd learn to read the silences, to see the exhaustion behind his eyes, and know when to just sit with him, offering my presence as a balm. One night, we were on the couch, a movie playing on the television that neither of us was watching. I was acutely aware of the inches of space between us, the same old fear trying to creep back in. He must have sensed it. He simply lifted his good arm and rested it on the back of the couch, an unspoken invitation. I hesitated for a heartbeat, and then I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. His arm came down, wrapping around me, pulling me securely against his side. He was so warm, so solid, a port in a storm. My storm. My heart settled, the frantic bird finally finding a safe place to land. The first time he stayed the night in my room, not as a result of a storm-induced confession, but because we both wanted him to, I lay awake for hours. Not from anxiety, but from wonder. I listened to the sound of his slow, deep breathing beside me, the sheer reality of him a constant, grounding presence in the dark. I had spent so many nights in that room alone, dreaming of a connection I never thought I'd have. And now here it was, real and warm, and breathing next to me. I finally understood that Marcus wasn't a disruption to my quiet life. He was the missing piece of it. His stillness didn't clash with my solitude. It complemented it. He was the only person whose silence ever felt as comfortable as my own. He hadn't breached the walls of my fortress to tear them down. He had come inside to live there with me. Looking back, I see my life as two distinct volumes. The time before Marcus and the time after. Before, I was an observer, a boy behind glass, documenting a world I was too afraid to touch. My art was a barrier, a way to process my longing from a safe distance. I was safe in my quiet kingdom, but I was profoundly alone. Marcus was the plot twist I never saw coming. He walked into my quiet life, a man of stone and silence, and showed me that true strength wasn't about building walls, but about having the courage to let someone see the cracks in them. He taught me that intimacy isn't found in grand gestures, but in the silent, steady presence of someone who sees you, truly sees you, and chooses to stay. He didn't save me from my solitude. He showed me how to share it. And in doing so, He gave me the one thing I had always been missing, a reason to step out from behind the glass and finally live.